Shadow Priest has been reworked again! Hey there, welcome back to Marcelian&Flame. We're looking at all of the classes on the 11.2 PTR coming up this summer, and Shadow Priest has its turn right now with its spotlight being yet another rework. People call it a rework. Let's see if it is indeed a rework or just some changes in the talents, because I think it's actually going into a great direction. And Shadow Priest is doing crazy damage right now on the PTR, which has nothing to do with the rework, but thought I said that because that's really what people care about in the end. First of all, let's talk about the kind of new things and then go into some issues with what I believe the rework has that needs to be fixed, and all of this from the perspective of an average Shadow Priest player, of somebody who plays all of the specs in the game almost every patch. So I kind of have my toes dipped into how some of the specs are designed, what the performance is, and what would ideally be cool and fun. But that's just my opinion. If you have your opinion, let us know in the comment section down below so that we can have a little chat and move Shadow Priest into a great direction. First of all, let's start with some of the spicier ones. The idols, which are supposedly the cornerstones of the spec, which are still not, but we are not in the issues part of the video just yet. Idol of Yashraj and Idol of N'Zoth have been changed a little bit, where Idol of Yashraj or Yasharj, I don't know how people pronounce this anymore, your damaging spells have a chance to grant Call of the Void, increasing your haste by 15% for 12 seconds. When Call of the Void ends, you are afflicted with Overburdened Mind, reducing your haste by 10% for 8 seconds. So clearly this is a kiss curse intended mechanic where you get a lot of haste for 12 seconds and you get penalized by taking away some haste for a short amount of time, taking away less haste. Now, because there's this downside effect to it, it's unclear exactly how much power you're supposed to be getting through this particular talent. I'm not opposed to these up and downs parts of the spec and your damage profile if it's something that you can probably exploit to some degree. And we're gonna get into the problems with the idols, but as far as this is concerned, this is just very RNG. It's very hard to tell when this is happening. You have no control over it, of course. So if it's go time for you and you want to do your damage, and that's when the downside of this procs, it's going to be a little bit underwhelming. I'm not convinced this is how it's going to last, because you have to give the players some kind of a control so that they can use this during their burst, during their Voidweaver burst if they play Voidweaver, or maybe their Void Eruption if they play Archon. N'Zoth has also been changed. Now, you create horrific visions when casting harmful spells on enemies. At 50 stacks of horrific visions, your target sees a nightmare, dealing quite a bit of shadow damage and granting you 4 insanity over 3 seconds. At 100 stacks, your target witnesses a vision of N'Zoth, dealing more than triple that damage again and granting you 12 insanity over 3 seconds. So this is kind of completely shifted because for all intents and purposes, this is single target. It doesn't proc the waves of damage that it used to do, but also it's passive. Maybe overall the functionality of this is better. Of course, the tuning can always change. One of the biggest change that happened was to the talent that was empowering Void Torrent to be 30-second cooldown. That was in between it and Void and Cthulhu rather, which is now called Void Volley. It's a lot of Void stuff. So Void Volley is essentially a button that replaces your Void Torrent after you cast Void Torrent, and you can recast it to do damage. So essentially this releases a volley of pure void energy, firing 10 bolts at your target and 1 bolt at all enemies within 10 yards of your target. So essentially 10 to 1 target and then 1 to everybody else. It doesn't seem like this is target cap, which is great because there's a lot of target capping going around with Shadow Priest. So it's nice to have like a little bit of burst, a little bit of upfront damage as you start going into combat, particularly in Mythic Plus. I could see this being relevant, but of course, since the majority of the time this does single target damage, I believe that this would have value across the board. Not to mention it's an easy way to get to Cthulhu without having to spend the 2 points on Insidious Ire that's right next to it, if that ever becomes a problem to not be taken for some reason, which I don't know if that's true. Madness Weaving is kind of like a new talent as well, from what I understand. It's a 2-pointer all the way to the left-hand side that makes the damage bonus from your mastery, Shadow Weaving, gain 25% additional benefit from Devouring Plague. This is a particularly weird talent because clearly this is something that has very obvious synergies with Void Eruption that just procs your mastery instantly and kind of forces you to have like 3 dots on everything. It has synergy with Void Eruption, but when you go to this particular part of the talent tree, I don't know if you necessarily take Void Eruption. It's also 2 points to spend. I'm not sure what I think about this. I would like to play more Void Eruption, but some of these sounds are a little bit weird. Shadow Crash has been kind of slightly reworked in a good way. It's now all the way to the right-hand side of the talent tree, and it has the 2 choice nodes where you opt to hurl a bolt yourself and aim it on the ground, or it would just go automatically to your target. Now, the following talents that used to buff it are baked in, where you automatically apply the Vampiric Touch, and if you have Misery, of course, you apply Shadow War Pain to all of your targets. But it also changed in the sense that you have 2 charges of it right now, making it a much bigger improvement of quality of life. Incredible. But you only hit 6 targets with it, or at least apply the dots to 6 targets, which is not the end of the world, considering that the 2 charges essentially can help you put 12 dots on everybody. And it seems for now that the dot application is smart cast, whereas before, if I recall, there was an issue with this where you would throw Shadow Crash and it could try to reapply Vampiric Touch to a target that already might have had Vampiric Touch. If you were in AoE and you were casting Vampiric Touch on a bunch of targets and then Shadow Crashing, you might have refreshed some instead of just expending it on more. But now you can actually do that. If the pool isn't big enough to warn you using both of those charges, you can Vampiric Touch on 1 or 2 targets and then throw out your Shadow Crash to apply it to the rest. And with it came a new talent underneath it that it says Descending to Darkness, increases Shadow Crash damage by 300%. This is a little bit weird. First of all, Shadow Crash damage is very tiny, so increasing it by 300% doesn't really do much. It feels like it's kind of a requirement to get easy access to Void Torrent. Otherwise, if you want Void Torrent and you want Void Torrent, you would have to spend 3 points into Dark Evangelism and Instilled Doubt. And that's just not very practical. I mean, you might also take those in certain situations. So maybe in those situations, you can save up the point on Shadow Crash because you're likely never going to use Shadow Crash for that damage. Dark Evangelism is also kind of tied to Shadow Crash. So if you don't want Shadow Crash, because Dark Evangelism used to kind of be a single target talent or a talent that you might have wanted in a single target, now you have to take Shadow Crash to get Dark Evangelism, and that's maybe pointless. Although there is an argument to be made that Shadow Crash could be useful to do in single target if you take the extra damage that it does initially. It might be a better way to apply or refresh your Vampiric Touch instead of having to actually manually cast Vampiric Touch. So it's not really the end of the world, but whenever there's a restriction like this, it's kind of a little bit icky. A new talent, that's a choice node with Mental Decay. Shattered Psyche. Mind Flay damage increases the critical strike chance of Mind Blast by 8%, stacking up to 12 times, and the buff on itself lasts about 10 seconds. This seems to have obvious value for Voidweaver, where your Mind Blast essentially turns into Void Blast. Now, I don't know if this applies to Void Blast as well, because a lot of the Mind Blast implications, the resets, the instant cast and all that, apply to Void Blast as well. I would imagine this would apply to Void Blast as well, which would make it an incredibly strong talent for Voidweaver, and overall just really good. We're gonna see more crit interactions with the spec. A new talent that might make me want to play Shadow Priest if they actually double down on this mechanic is Phantom Menace. Increases the critical strike chance of shadowy apparitions by 10% and their critical strike damage by 40%. Now, from what I understand, and I was looking at one of the best theory crafters for Shadow Priest, Public, all hail the Lord, that has made a video feedbacking this as well. It seems that Shadow Apparitions didn't have their individual chance to crit because maybe there was a scaling issues and they reverted this, and now they have this talent in where you can increase the critical strike chance of Shadow Apparitions and their damage by 40%, which is crazy because I love the playstyle of Shadow Apparition Shadow Priest, and that's kind of taken a backseat in the last couple of years because it was incredibly undertuned, so fingers crossed that this comes back. Subservient Shadows is also a new talent, a very interesting one, where summon minions last 20% longer and deal an additional 15% damage. This is probably one of the best talents that you have right now because this actually applies to everything that Shadow Priest does, from your Mindbender to your Shadow Fiend to your little Cthulhu tentacly things and all the things that Voidweaver does as well. Overall, big increase in damage. I personally am a fan of pet builds, even if the pets are well, actually, despite the fact that Shadow Priest pets are very passive and actually probably the best pets in the game, period, because they don't have the weird AI that makes them block, at least that I know of. So this is really cool if you like to spawn all those tentacly things, and you're probably going to be spawning them no matter what build you play. So this might be a mandatory talent to take. Dark Thoughts is also a new talent, I believe, where it increases the chance for shadowy insight to occur by 25%. When consuming shadowing insight, Mind Blast generates 1 additional insanity. And this is what I meant, that a lot of Mind Blast interactions work with Voidweaver, because this might actually be a mandatory talent for Voidweaver. I don't know why I called it Voidweaver. It's probably Zaltath in my brain melting some neurons right now. It does make Voidweaver and Void Blast a lot more interactive and a lot more fun, because you do get more procs of casting those Void Bolts, which is the whole point of Voidweaver and makes it way more fun to play, giving him way more damage and be a little bit more competitive, although it is kind of overpowering at this point. And last but not least, Instill Doubt is the 2-pointer that I mentioned before, where it increases critical strike chance of Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain by 8% and their critical strike damage by 20%. And critical strike has always been really good for shadowy apparitions as well, because critical strikes increase the chance for shadowy apparitions to spawn by the talent Tormented Spirits, which is down below. Again, more synergy for the potential build of shadowy apparitions, which I really want to come back, man. I really want to get back to this style of play of Shadow Priest. Now let's talk a little bit about the issues, and the biggest one probably is still a very archaic way of designing talents which Shadow Priest doesn't seem to be able to shake off, which is the utility / defensive talents that you still have to take away from you building your class. I'm talking about Dispersion and Silence still being in the class tree, something that Shadow Priests have been talking about for a long time. Now, you could argue that they're made so easily accessible that you don't really have to worry about ever having to choose between them and something else. You could also argue that you're not getting any other damage by talenting into these, but at the same time, they could just make other talents way stronger to compensate for the fact that you're losing about 2 talent points to get these particular talents. So it's kind of like a discussion that can go back and forth. I feel like the only real argument that you can have is that it just feels kind of bad to have to talent into those, particularly for Silence, because it is incredibly weak as an interrupt in the world of modern World of Warcraft, where kicks are so important and so crucial, to the point where, from what I understand, top Shadow Priests are being told, bro, just don't take it anymore. We don't really need the Silence because it's a 45-second cooldown, 1 target Silence, not to mention that the upgrades for it you're probably never going to take. They don't even lead to anything for you to be incentivized to pick either Last Word or Psychic Horror of any kind. It's a terribly weak crowd control for modern combat design. Either they rework it or make it baseline and put something else there that's maybe a little bit more cool. Maybe give Shadow Priest mobility, or maybe bring Mindseer back. God damn it. Again, I mentioned the idols that were added and the changes. They're just way too passive. As something that probably is the coolest thing that Shadow Priest can bring to the table in terms of its flavor, the old god idols are just way too passive. They just happen. You have close to no interactions with them at all. You sometimes are able to see them, sometimes are able to not. They don't really impact your cooldown usage. It's just a little bit too boring, and I really hope that they can make this a little bit more interactive. I mentioned throughout this video the apparitions build. Although they had added a bunch of talents that would make it really great, it's still under-tuned. Of course, tuning is going to change through the course of the PTR, but I did want to put my 2 cents out there. Apparitions are just way too weak at this point. On top of this, talking about damage, Devouring Plague just doesn't do damage for some reason, where it just feels like it's an added bonus to your mastery and not really contributing a lot to its overall performance. Bro, I don't know, I feel like that's the consumer. That's what takes away your resources. That should hit the hardest, and particularly for Voidweaver, Void Blast just like cranks it out of the park. Listen, I like Void Blast as much as the next Shadow Priest, and it doing a lot of damage, or the most damage, is not necessarily a problem, but Devouring Plague being such a low performer of overall damage performance just feels like it's a debuff you need to maintain and not what's consuming your resource. So I'm not a fan. I'm just not a fan. And I mentioned, of course, Descending Darkness. It's the problem that can be put together in the same box with having utility and defensives in the talent tree. If you add damage to a utility ability, which Shadow Crash is kind of a utility ability, you want to spread dots, then you kind of change the scope and what the reason for this ability is. You don't want to use Shadow Crash for the damage that it deals. You want to use Shadow Crash to spread the dots. If Shadow Crash starts to do way too much damage where you want to cast it, regardless of the fact that you're spreading dots, it kind of changes the scope and the purpose of the ability. I can probably guess that Descending Darkness is supposed to give you a little bit more value for using that Shadow Crash, so you have some damage. It's not just like a debuff ability. And of course, Shadow Crash does inherently indirectly deal damage because it uses one global to put up 6 dots instead of you having to cast Vampiric Touch 6 times. So you could say that it's still a damage gain, but this just makes it a little bit weird, and it might actually force you, if Shadow Crash gets enough damage, to use Shadow Crash for damage. And if it doesn't, then what's the point of this talent anyway, when you can have something else that may be a little bit cooler. And last but not least, arguably a still bigger problem, or maybe the biggest still yet, Shadow Priest is probably one of the specs with the most 2 talent point nodes, period. Not only are they particularly boring and annoying and cumbersome to use to path through your talent tree, it just feels a little bit old when you have so many other specs that have clearly revamped this style of talent design, where they probably gotten rid of almost all of the 2 talent point nodes. I understand that they maybe are placed to kind of gate you from getting too many capstones, because you can actually run 3 capstones with Shadow Priest, and if you take away the 2 talent point nodes at the bottom and make them 1 talent point, you're probably going to be able to run all of them. That might be a little bit too much, sure, but maybe we can just put more talent nodes, period, instead of the 2 talent point nodes. Not to mention the fact that we also have freaking still points that we need to put into Dispersion and Silence. This is just the first iteration of Shadow Priest. It's looking definitely better. I'm glad we got rid of Mind Spike for one thing, and I'm hoping that we can get more mobility style talents and maybe Mind Sphere back in the future, but that's just a cope at this point. Let us know what you think down below, and if you like all of these cool new reworks, you definitely need to check the Frost DK one, because it's the best one right now that we have in the game, completely changing the spec and making it really, really, really cool. See you next time.